Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to start out providing some background just because I know the topic may not be familiar with everyone. So the grass carp, they were first imported to the U.S. in the 1960s for research purposes. Fairly quickly they escaped, made it into the Mississippi River, and have started moving northwards. They were first detected in the Great Lakes and Lake Erie in the mid-1980s, although there were a couple of captures of grass carp in the Milwaukee River a couple of years even before that. And throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, captures were infrequent. They also may have been unreported. But in the around 2010, the captures in Lake Erie, primarily by commercial fishers, started to increase. Now there is evidence that there is naturalized production occurring in Lake Erie. So starting with Chapman, they assessed ploidy of 4 age 1 fish that were collected from the Sandusky River. They were able to determine ploidy for 2 of those fish, and they were diploid. But based on otolith microchemistry, they believed all 4 were identified or were produced from the Sandusky River. And then Emke et al., they collected eggs from the Sandusky River in 2015. They didn't collect any in 2016, but then they collected some more in 2017 and 18. Because of this, there was another study that just looked at a larger ploidy evaluation of fish collected, again, primarily by commercial fishers from the Lake Erie Western Basin, and they found that almost 90% of the fish that they tested were diploid. And then just recently, they've confirmed eggs and larvae of grass carp coming from the Maumee River. So kind of this combination of evidence of naturalized production as well as elevated catches really brought the thinking of control of grass carp to the forefront. And there was also at the same time there were risk evaluations being conducted for grass carp as well. But one of the big things, grass carp ecology isn't really well known. It hasn't been broadly studied. In particular, how fish move through systems such as the Great Lakes and just their general space use. And so this issue of not knowing much about movement or space use it actually showed up in the risk assessment as well. So this is just a couple of quotes about not knowing much about movement and how it affects evaluations of risk. But then the Lake Erie Committee also issued a position statement just on Asian carps in general, which grass carp fit within that scope, just indicating that some information regarding movement, space use, tagging studies in general could help with control efforts. I think it's the evidence of needing assistance or needing information to help with control is also illustrated by a very large response exercise that was conducted on Lake Erie in 2014. It was a biologists from a lot of agencies coming together to try to collect grass carp. It was kind of a practice response to if some other Asian carp were ever detected. But this was focused on just trying to collect grass carp. Where to sample was informed by a lot of eDNA collection occurring. Like I said, this was a pretty large sampling effort. There was almost 100 hours of electrofishing time, setting gill nets, contracting with commercial fishers to pull very long commercial seine hauls. And with all that effort, they collected 2 grass carp, but they saw 2 others that they didn't collect. So again, anybody who's worked with grass carp will generally say these fish are very difficult to capture. So that's what kind of prompted this study, was just to gain a better understanding of grass carp distribution, but also how they move around in western Lake Erie. And the purpose is really just to inform control efforts, and also the information can be used to better understand the risk that grass carp pose to spreading to other areas of Lake Erie as well as to the other Great Lakes. So again, the purpose of this is to just kind of make it easier to collect these fish. So this is just pictures of 2 grass carp that were collected within the last couple of weeks in the Sandusky River. They were collected by commercial fishers. Again, commercial fishers have by far been better at collecting these fish than the states have, and so we're just trying to get the information to learn more about how we can control them. So for this study, for the initial go-around on the study, we tagged 50 fish with acoustic telemetry transmitters between 2014 and 2017. The fish came from a pretty broad size range, so 50 to 128 centimeters. They're up to 28 kilograms, up to 14 years of age, and like the at-large population, a lot of them were diploid. This just kind of shows where we've tagged the fish. It's that the tagging has been pretty opportunistic as to where we're able to collect the fish. Again, most of them were coming from commercial fishers, so a high number were tagged in the Sandusky River. So the Sandusky River, this is kind of a Plum Creek area where fish also seem to congregate, and then Huron River and Maumee River. Now, we're using, if you're not familiar with acoustic telemetry, the idea is that we're putting these transmitters in these fish that occasionally, every 2 or 3 minutes, send out a unique signal. And then in Lake Erie, there's a whole lot of these receivers, these listening stations, that if a fish is close enough to that receiver, the transmitter pings, we'll get the time and the date that the fish was detected on that receiver. So, like I said, Lake Erie has a lot of these receivers out there. Where the receivers have been deployed have kind of changed over the years. So in 2015, they were relying pretty heavily on these kind of these lines that just extended across different areas, just to get an idea of how fish were moving throughout the lake. Starting later on, they moved over to more of a grid-like pattern, and even more recently, you can just see the number of receivers that are being deployed. For our study, we were putting receivers mostly in the tributaries because we were wanting to see how they were using them. So so in terms of the results, the one thing that we found was that the movement was greater than what we expected. So we've seen tagged fish displace. So we refer to displacement as the furthest distance that a fish was located from its original tagging site. We've seen these fish displace up to 230 kilometers. More than a quarter of the fish had displacements greater than 100 kilometers. And you generally think of grass carp as cows. They're going to stay in one area. But we're seeing these cows move up to 20 to 40 kilometers in a day. So they're moving more than what we thought. All the fish were tagged in the Western Basin. 4 of the fish did temporarily move into the central and the eastern basins, but they eventually returned to the Western Basin. And then we did have 1 fish that we tagged move into Lake Huron and has not come back yet. So this is just to show some of the movements that we're seeing. So this star just indicates where this particular fish was tagged. So this fish was tagged in 2014, spent a lot of time in the Sandusky River. Around 1st of August, was detected outside of the Sandusky Bay. It went missing for about 10 months and then showed up on an array over by Cleveland. So that took about 10 months for it to go 86 kilometers. It showed up on that same receiver kind of sporadically for the next year or so. And then within 2 days, it made that 86 kilometer run back to the Sandusky River. So showed back up into the Sandusky River June 12th. And then since then has kind of, checked out other areas, gone up into the Detroit River even. Again, here's another fish. This one was tagged again in Sandusky Bay. After tagging, it eventually went up to the Detroit River. So it was there around July 11th. Within 2 days, it had moved around 50 kilometers. One thing to remember is that these are minimum distances. It could have moved even further than that. So, 50 kilometers in 2 days. Then it moved 211 kilometers in 5 days. Went even further into Pennsylvania waters. Went missing for 4 months or so, and then slowly made its way back into the Sandusky River. And then this just shows the fish that moved into Lake Huron. So this was a fish that was tagged in this Plum Creek area. It didn't move at all for around 8 months. We were thinking that the fish was dead. And then it kind of went exploring around for about a week, checked out some other tributaries, like around the Maumee River, some places close to the Sandusky River. It then came back to Plum Creek, stayed there for a while, and then it started making its way up into Lake Huron. So within a week, it had run pretty much through the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair River, and into Lake Huron. So again, these fish are moving a lot more than what we thought. So I think the risk of spread may be even greater than what has been originally believed. Now, in terms of information for control purposes, the areas that we've seen the highest use has been these 4 tributaries. So Sandusky River, Plum Creek, Maumee River, and Detroit River. And one of the surprising things is that we've been finding fish using the Sandusky River year-round, and some of the fish residing almost entirely in the river itself. And you talk to Ohio biologists, and they say there's nothing really in there for them to eat in the river itself, but clearly there's something in there because they are in there for long periods of time. And we are seeing pretty good areas of where the grass carp are using, which I'll be getting into here in a second, and where grass carp collections have occurred. So collections both by commercial fishers and then by agency collections. So this just shows what receivers grass carp have been collected on. So this is just all of Lake Erie. The white indicates where receivers have been deployed. Not all of these receivers are out year-round. So some of these are on or off at different times of year. And then the circles just indicates the total number of grass carp detections that have occurred on the receivers. So the larger circle means more detections. So you really see, again, the Sandusky River, Maumee River, this Plum Creek and Detroit River. We're seeing big circles and lots of circles. So to us, that's an indication of use. And then if you just look at the number of unique fish detections, so in this case, a larger circle means there's been more fish uniquely detected. Again, you see the Sandusky River having a lot of fish using it, and it's not necessarily just fish that were tagged in the Sandusky River. We see fish tagged in Plum Creek that will eventually show up into the Sandusky River. So Sandusky River, Maumee River, Plum Creek, and Detroit River again. So that really seems to be those areas where fish are using. And like I said before, one of the surprising findings was the level of use in the Sandusky River. And so this just shows where we have receivers deployed this last summer in the river, and then the corresponding river kilometers of where these fish are at, or where the receivers are at. And now these are just some slides showing fish detections on those receivers over different times of year. So the vertical line will just indicate when a fish was tagged. We've got date running along this axis. And then if a black line shows receivers and whether they were on at certain times of year. So initially we'd expected we would see something like this, where just fish use the receivers or use the river around the times that might be associated with spawning. So this was a fish tagged in 2014. It's actually tagged in Michigan waters, but June 2015 showed up in the Sandusky River, showed up again around June 2016, didn't run the full length of the river, didn't show up in 2017, but then showed up again in 2018. So that's what we expected, but we actually see more cases of this where fish, again, are spending long periods of time in the river. And they're, so up here is where fish is the area associated with spawning. And we're seeing fish using these areas during the winter time. So again, this wasn't something that we were necessarily expecting. If you look at detections across a longer time period and all the fish, again, you start seeing, this river is used for long periods of time. And this is just focusing on time periods when we had pretty consistent coverage. So again, you're seeing fish using the river, upper areas of the river during the winter. So we then, we thought we could use this to inform where's the best place to implement control. So using this detection information, we then fit a spatial capture recapture model where there's a lot of parameters in it, but the main thing we're interested in is to identify what they call activity centers. So, or you can just think of them as home range centers, where are the fish really spending the main part of their time, where they centered at during different days. And so we end up with something like this, where again, the black just indicates raw detections, and we have these black lines that are jumping back and forth. That's what the model is suggesting as the home range center for that particular fish on any individual day. And the gray just indicates a measure of uncertainty. So you can get that for each individual fish. But ultimately, we're interested in is the activity centers across all the fish over the whole time period. And so this is what that pattern looks like. And now you can think about just taking this graph, rotating it, and just smashing the dates down, or just consolidating across the dates to get an idea of what does the distribution of activity centers look like for these fish, and perhaps that's informative with regards to control. So this is that distribution, ignoring season, just looking at it across the whole time period. And the map just shows kind of the general locations of the receivers. These circles, the gray circles, indicate where capture locations, mostly by commercial fishers, have occurred. So a darker circle will indicate more detections. And so you see that these fish really seem to be congregating around this area. So the lower part of the river, this is the area associated with spawning. So again, fish, they do use that area up there as well. You can look at it across different seasons. So this is looking at it by winter, where fish actually seem to be using more of a upstream area than they did kind of just overall. But as you progress into spring, they seem to fall back. They do start picking up some of this upstream spawning area. You get into the summer again, they're either down at this lower part of the river or they're using the upper part. And then during the fall, they become more dispersed. So in terms of control efforts, if we want to focus on where those main activity centers are, this would be the regions that seem to be the best place to implement control efforts. So again, this lower part of the river, the area just around the spawning area. This green circle is the location where Emke identified spawning to occur. And so, we're continuing to focus, because there's been so many fish collected in the Sandusky River, we've even expanded the receiver coverage just to be able to pinpoint even more where the fish are occurring. So these purple dots indicate where we currently have receivers. So we've actually put in about 15 more receivers. We're actually going to be putting more into the Sandusky Bay, because this is kind of the big unknown at this point, is how are fish falling back into the bay and using that area, and are there opportunities for control in that region. We're also trying to get some more finer scale space use. So this is that Hot Ponds, Plum Creek area where we've put in a positional array. So when we have fish come into this region, we can actually try to pinpoint their exact locations. And there's also this coming year, they're looking at implementing more of a Judas fish control, where there's currently real-time receivers deployed in the Sandusky River and Plum Creek. So these are receivers that when fish are detected, it sends out an email to folks. So we know a fish is in that system at that particular time. And agencies are, again, looking to implement control actions when those fish are detected. And there's going to be 3 more these real-time receivers going in the Sandusky River and Maumee River. Ohio DNR is going to be putting those in, and Michigan DNR will be installing a real-time receiver on the Detroit River. So again, this is just to better implement control efforts. And I'm about out of time, so I'll just end there.